topics that I investigate, which is the endothelium. The key tissue, the title is not from me, but I believe it's really the key tissue, and I try to convince you from this. So in terms of an introduction to sepsis, I don't want to go into any detail here, it's all known for you, but just I find this always kind of fascinating to see one death every 2.8 seconds essentially means that when I'm done, so in 15 minutes, more than 400 people will be dead from the disease. Mm-hmm. So you know this, but you know that we don't have a lot of treatments to tackle it. So the strategies are really based on 4 major columns, at least from the way I like to group them. And 2 of them are just dealing with the infection, and 1 major column deals with the support of failed organs, which means that we kind of try to help them recovering, giving the fluids, giving the pressors, using renal replacement therapy. These are absolutely no treatments of sepsis, because sepsis is the dysfunctional host response. We don't know really what it is, but that's what we would need, a modulation of this dysfunctional host response. And if you see this list, you cannot read this, but you will see they're all negative. These are all therapies that have worked in mice, but have absolutely failed in humans. So we have a translational gap here. We're a little bit lost in translation. And this is probably because it's super heterogeneous. The monitoring of the immune system is extremely difficult for us. So one patient could be in a hyperinflammation, one system could be in a hyperinflammation situation, the other system could be already immunosuppressed. It's non-linear, and it's also compartmentalized. And I think that's really critical, because we always only look at the tip of the iceberg. We measure stuff in the blood, but there's the tissue, there's the central nervous system, the lung, and so on. So it's really hard to tailor treatments. So what could be the approach then? If you look at the host response, it's not just driven by the immune system. The immune system interacts with the 2 systems we want to look at this morning, which is the coagulation and the endothelial dysfunction. And the endothelial dysfunction has a really good rationale to look at this, because these clinical features that you know very well from the bedside, they all have a very strong vascular component that drives this clinical phenomenon. So it's really reasonable to look at the endothelium as a key tissue involved in the host response of this disease. And this would be a large example. It's a 1-cell thick layer that lines any vessel in our body. There can be large vessels that have muscles, elastic fibers, you know all this from anatomy. We have small capillaries that are really characterized by just 1-cell thick layer, which not a lot of other cells behind. And overall, we have 10 to the power of 13 cells that would correspond to 8 tennis court fields, if you would line them up. So surface of up to 7,000 square meters. So it's a huge amount of cells and tissues. And it's also similarly heterogenic. So if you think of the kidney, the liver, the brain, these cells are totally differently characterized in different organs. And that's why they also have totally different biological functions. And that's important, because all of the functions can be altered in systemic inflammation. So most importantly, the barrier function. We will look into these things in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. The recruitment of immune cells from the circulation to a site of infection. If I have a pneumonia in my upper lobe, I need my endothelium to recruit the cells to this site of infection in order to fight the infection. So it's critically important that my endothelium responds to this infection. Gas exchange, coagulation, metabolism, the production of urine through the fenestrated endothelium in the glomerulum, the blood-brain barrier, you name it. There's so many biological functions of this tissue that it makes a lot of sense that if it's altered, we have trouble, and this contributes to multi-organ failure. So when we look at the phenotype of the septic endothelium, there are really a few things that are more dominantly accessible than others. And first of all is the pro-coagulatory situation we are in. And this is summarized in many very nice illustrated papers. Here, just one example of key players that are important here. It's the tissue factor that's overexpressed then on the monocytes, the microparticles, the overexpression of plasminogen activator inhibitor, and the lack of a fibrinolytic state. This all leads to this procoagulation, so that we have tiny clots in our microcirculation. A little bit less known is the system here about the von Willebrand factor, but I will show you more details on this. And the clinical features of this illustrated picture, we all know these are these horrible pictures. And this is driven by an endothelial dysfunction in the interaction with the coagulation system. Second point, a pro-adhesive surface. Remember the right upper lobe pneumonia I just quoted. If we want adhesion molecules there, to attract our neutrophils to fight this infection is a really good thing. Evolutionary, preserved mechanism that help us to survive. If this happens everywhere in our body, massive expression of these molecules, we recruit these inflammatory cells to sites where we don't have an infection, and this can harm the organ. So if it's local, it's good. If it's systemic, in this case, it would be really bad. And then also something we all know very well from the bad side is vasoplegia. It's driven by nitric oxide synthase that's induced in sepsis, and that makes massive vasoplegia. So it's this kind of disbalance between dilators and constrictors, nitric oxide being the most famous one that we all know very well, but there are other systems that are similarly altered. And obviously, you know, the result would be vasoplegic shock. And then there's a purpose that is of my special interest, which is the increased permeability. And permeability is also a mechanism that's required for our survival, but it's altered in a systemic way in sepsis, so that's really harmful. When we have these two routes, and you know that during sepsis, it's mostly this paracellular route that's disturbed. So we have junctions between these endothelial cells here that can open up, and thereby the water leaks into the interstitial space. And this is driven by many molecules, mostly tyrosine kinases on top of the endothelium, that modulate the connection between these adherents and tight junctions. And I picked one example because I've personally worked on this, so it's a little bit biased. Tyrosine kinase on top of the endothelium. If you activate this, so we all have this on all our endothelial cells, we all have this in our blood, so it's a constitutively on system, and it promotes antipermeability by tightening these junctions. During sepsis, we release the natural counterpart of this, angiopoietin-2. It blocks this, we lose the protective signal, very simplified. And you can see this here in kind of biomarker studies. The increasing strata of the disease show you increasing levels, increasing organ failure, as indicated by SOFA score, shows you increasing H2 values. It even discriminates for survival. And what is the beautiful part about this is, remember, I said it's really hard to monitor the immune system. We have different things at the same time, one go up, one go down. We have a roller coaster system which we cannot monitor. In terms of these vascular tyrosine kinase-driven responses, it's mostly linear. So if you may look at this part here, so in the survivors you have a continuously increasing level of angiopoietin-2, for example. So if you have a targeted therapy, this could really help to stratify your patient and to make a tailored personal therapy. A few examples how this could look like. Stressed endothelial cells by septic medium. If you add an antibody that blocks, so this would be the cellular correlate of your patient, if you block angiopoietin-2, you completely reverse this phenotype. You have no lags, you have no gaps anymore between the cells, and you have no actin stress fibers. You can also do these experiments in mice. You give them these antibodies. This is an assay where you can look for vascular leak, a blue dye that binds albumin. It's full in the lung. And if you treat mice with an antibody that blocks angiopoietin-2, you reverse this phenotype. A second example I picked that also goes for the junctions is this substance you have all heard about, the adrenomedulin. I'm not going to talk about the treatments because I'm sure this will be covered in the next or the next talk. It's a molecule that's well known since 30 years, but it has two interesting functions. If it stays in the vessel here in blue, it has antipermeability properties, but it's so small that it can easily travel in the interstitial space here, and there it has a second function on the vascular smooth muscle cell where it induces vasodilatation. So we really want all our adrenomedulin in the vessel, because there it's good. If it goes outside, it's not a good thing. And this has been measured in different populations, and cutoffs and biomarker studies are ongoing. Just an example here. This arbitrary cutoff of 70 nicely discriminates between survivors, non-survivors. Even better if you take a higher cutoff. So why could this be of importance? Because there is a drug that targets this, and we will probably hear about this later a little bit more, which is an antibody that's called atrikizumab. And antibodies, in my understanding, used to be something that blocked a function of a molecule, which is not the case, which is not true in any case. In this case, this antibody binds adrenomedulin, so the blue adrenomedulin in the vessel is bound by your antibody. That keeps it active. So the epitope that can do the good stuff is still active. But it's now so large that it cannot move anymore to the interstitium where it would have a bad function. So it's really a cool idea of a therapy, and I'm sure we will hear something about clinical data from this. So we switch gears a little bit, and we're now looking at the jungle. And the jungle for me is the glycocalyx. The glycocalyx is a sugar structure, a complex sugar structure on top of the endothelium, like a floating grass or a jungle. It's a network of membranes, and there are membrane proteins that are involved in many processes, and most of all they are involved in the regulation of permeability. So it's tyrosine kinases, the junctions, but also the sugar structure on top of the endothelium. And we know this, and you've seen these beautiful pictures, it's degraded by systemic inflammatory responses. And obviously it's not the cytokine that comes and eats up this jungle sugar structure. There are enzymes that digest this, and these are mostly the heparonases. And I've picked an example here. The green stuff here is heparonase 2. It's an enzyme that protects the integrity of our glycocalyx. In sepsis or in systemic inflammation, we have an increase of heparonase 1, the enzyme that cleaves this. So it's a heparonase that digests the glycocalyx, and it's an altered balance. So there's also increased apoptosis, so these cells everywhere in our body die at a higher amount, and there's altered microcirculation. I want to go into this a little bit more. We know the clinical phenotype. You have all seen these patients all the time, and you know that these are the guys you have to take particularly care of. But we don't have really good measures for the microcirculation. We do the mottling score. We can look at the lactate, all surrogates, but it's really a little bit hard to tackle the microcirculation. And on a more physiological level, the determinants for the altered microcirculation are leukocyte adherence, vascular leak, hemoconcentration, but I want to look a little bit with you into microangiopathy, intravascular coagulation, because this is also part of the topic of today's session here. So the endothelium in our body systemically does something what it always does. So if I have injury to my endothelium, it releases von Willebrand factor. And that's a good thing, because if I cut my finger and it bleeds, I want my endothelium to immediately release pre-stored von Willebrand factor. That's how we induce primary homeostasis. In sepsis, everywhere in our body, we release von Willebrand factor. So we have a lot of von Willebrand factor there. And in order to not clot our small vessels, we have an enzyme that digests this large von Willebrand factor, a super sticky protein that binds platelets, into small pieces. And this is ADAMTS-13. By having so much von Willebrand factor in the system, we lose the activity of this ADAMTS-13. Thereby, we're having a disbalance in this system as well. And this can lead, I mean, the pictures are from TTP, you know this, it's never that extreme, but I'm very sure that this is a strong contributor to microvascular dysfunction driven by endothelial dysfunction in sepsis. And does this matter? I have these two videos. I'm sure you have seen them in better quality because I took them with my iPhone, just to make the point. So on your left-hand side is a patient with pancreatitis, not septic, a little bit of norepinephrine, and it's this kind of micro circulatory measurement under the tongue with these cameras you've seen before. And if you focus on the small vessels, I don't want you to look at the bigger ones. Look at the small ones, you can see single individual erythrocytes traveling through the microcirculation. This is how a microcirculation should look like if the patient is not compromised. The second patient here, macrohemodynamically, looks pretty similar. Mean arterial pressure of 66, slightly tachycardic, but a much higher dose of norepinephrine, and he's in septic shock. And he had also a lactate of sure, and he was mottled. But if you look under the tongue, just to visualize what I was just trying to explain you physiologically, it looks like this, and it's really one of the most horrible cases I picked here, just to make the point. This is not a still standing movie. There's no flow in the microvasculature anymore at all in this patient. Although at the bedside you think doesn't look that bad. So just to underlining that if you probably introduce some von Willebrand cleaving protease, you can intervene with this system, maybe. So let me summarize. Why endothelium is the key tissue in sepsis. I hoped to convince you a little bit that it has at least an important function. So this function in the center, driven by a few phenotypes that are important, the increased permeability, the increased interaction with the coagulation system, local and systemic inflammation driven by adhesion molecules that recruit leukocytes to everywhere, and this results to hyperperfusion of any organ. At the same time, nitric oxide release leads to distributive shock and vasodilatation, and this is the major driver for organ failure that we might be able to modulate on the microcirculatory and at the macrocirculatory level. And I'm open for questions, and I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Excellent overview, Sascha. Thank you for that. There must be some questions because you said some intriguing things, I think. People in the back, there are plenty of seats in the front here if you want to come up. So what really struck me is that you think that the loss of vessel wall integrity, right, that is a good therapeutic target because of the linearity. We've been disappointed before in thinking something is upregulated, let's block it. So from the, is loss of barrier integrity, is it something, can you think of something good of that, or is it only bad?
So nothing is only bad that has survived evolution, I would say. And I think the point I wanted to make with the example of the pneumonia, the local infection, is that these things, permeability is something really important. Think of an inflamed finger due to an infection. There are the cardinal symptoms of inflammation. There's swelling and all this. That's all increased permeability and increased adhesion of leukocytes, transmigration. We do need this. I think the problem is if this occurs on a systemic level at places where we don't need the permeability, then it becomes a bad thing. But per se, molecular-driven regulation of permeability, that's something super important that we need. And that's also a challenge and risk for treatment, of course. Because if I have a treatment that's so effective that it would completely block my permeability, it could mean that in my right upper lobe, where I have my pneumonia, I also lose my permeability, and there it would be required. I have not seen a treatment that was that effective that it would completely block permeability. But theoretically, there's also a threat. Yeah.
May I just one question? Is there any question from the floor? No. My question, Sascha, during your presentation, my thoughts were, I can measure that at the bedside. How can I just measure in the next patient the endothelial activity? Because, you know, in my mind, today, the evaluation of the patient is by the SOFA score. In the SOFA score, with only the platelets related to endothelium. Have you any tips to suggest us for evaluation of the patient at the bedside?
To measure endothelial dysfunction as a global, or to measure a particular part of, I mean, there are technologies. The microcirculatory measurement under the tongue is something, but from my point of view, it's far away from clinical application. But there are researchers working on this, and they are on a good path. There are biomarkers, and biomarkers like angiopoietin 2. I picked this because it has been studied most extensively, also in ARDS, where this leak is a similar phenomenon. And that now it's an ELISA, and it takes you 4 hours. But these are things that, if we drive this by the industry, supported by industry, you can always develop this in a point-of-care fashion, so that you have a troponin of leakage, of leakiness. I'm not believing in these measurements, or I do not believe in extravascular lung water and stuff like this at this moment, because the patient comes to the ward, there was not yet so much fluid given, so you cannot really measure the accumulation of fluid as a measure of permeability. So I would say biomarkers, but there was a question here.
Is there a question?
Thanks for your talk. Do you have any ideas about how we can assess visually the microcirculation under the tongue? So maybe intraoperatively, for example, assessing the microcirculation in different organs.
So you were asking for other methods where I could visualize the microcirculatory dysfunction, other than under the tongue. Yeah, I mean, we've tried this at places I don't want to talk about, but there are other holes in our body. So you need mucosa, okay? So, but I've seen also surgeons doing stuff during the OR and applying the technology, so the technology works. I think the retina could be a clever thing. I've done this with zebrafish, to be honest, but it's actually, I never thought about the retina for humans. It could be a clever tool to visualize it. Other than that, I have no idea.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Sascha, again.
Thank you.